I'm really thrilled to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today as well, recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways, and I also pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to respectfully advise that my presentation today includes artworks depicting Indigenous Australians. Scotsman James Muir arrived in Melbourne in September 1852, part of the first wave of gold seekers who travelled to Australia in the hope of striking it rich. At sea, he'd agreed to join a party of young men who intended to head straight to the rich central Victorian diggings. After a week's walk that tested their endurance and their patience, they reached Bendigo. Their first task was to fashion a tent for themselves out of a jumble of items carried with them. As Muir narrated, apologies. There we go, thank you. We, without delay, set about making for ourselves a house, but where was the stuff to make it of? One said he had some needles and thread, but that seemed small help, until another, who had bought some fine bed linen with his blankets, pulled it from his swag, and remarking that it would be none the worse for the bleaching, offered it to make a roof. A third gave a tartan plaid, and a fourth a blanket. A fifth, in the enthusiasm of the moment, tore a striped shirt open and, throwing it with 2 towels among the other offerings, said these would make a gable. While some were fixing forked sticks to the ground to bear the ridgepole and attending to the fire and supper, the rest were busy, without thimbles, at the needlework. This comment fascinated me when I first read it. Although I was researching women's needlework in Gold Rush Victoria, it was clear that men also found sewing a useful, if not essential, skill. However, my interest at that time was a link between needlework and femininity. So I put this comment to one side, intending to come back to it to explore why men sewed, what and how this might have impacted their identities, given, as David Goodman and other scholars of Australia's gold rush history have noted, the Victorian goldfields were masculine landscapes, populated in the early years of alluvial digging by more men than women, and by work which demanded physical strength and endurance. I anticipated there might be insights to be gained by investigating the domestic practices of men on the diggings, particularly when gold seeking exaggerated masculine behaviours, producing a particular understanding of gender and promoting some identities, but not others. What James R. Muir and other diggers sewed and how they framed these practices when needlework was defined as a feminine activity forms the basis of my presentation today. So, sewing held a critical place in the female experience. Both complex and conflicting, it opens up really rich possibilities for interrogating constructions of 19th century womanhood. Needlework was fundamental in the education of girls, teaching them the cultural signs of femininity, and it remained central to the domestic responsibilities of wives and mothers. More working women were involved in the needlework industry than any other, apart from those in domestic service. My aim today then is twofold: to explore men's needlework practices, which kept them clothed, warm and dry on the goldfields, and beyond that, to consider how men approached sewing tasks, given their inextricable links with women. I use a range of primary sources, including letters, diaries, memoirs and immigrants' guides. And when taken together, these provide a rich history, not only of the period, but also of the minutiae of daily life beyond the dominant narratives that circulated about Goldfields living. I'm especially interested today in the first decade of the Victorian rush, so from 1851 through to 1861, although gold, of course, continued to be found long after this, when gold-seeking transitioned from alluvial fossicking, encouraging small teams of men to work together, to deeper underground enterprises. Yeah. Sorry, and I'm a quiet talker as well. Maybe I need to lean a bit more. Tell me if that's a bit better. Yeah. Does that sound okay? Sorry, I'm such a quiet talker. Just somebody give me a motion like that to, if you need me to talk up again. Yeah, thank you. So following his return to Scotland after 3 years in Victoria, James R. Muir published his reminiscences in The Diggings, the Bush in Melbourne. In it, he openly acknowledged turning his hand to needlework, and he wasn't the only man to do so. Writing with humour for what he called his small circle of intimate acquaintances, his reader is left in no doubt of Muir's shortcomings with the needle. The diggers, sleeping 6 in a row, wake in their improvised tent to the sound of their first storm. Muir writes, "The sewing gives way and the water comes spouting through the openings. We try to stop the leaks with our caps and stockings, but we only make the breaches bigger." This comic picture, above all else, reveals their needlework's failings. Though aiming to protect themselves from the elements, they are instead left exposed. So this device, the suggestion of a lack of skill to avoid an uneasy association with feminine labour, is one that I will return to as we explore men's performance of needlework on the diggings. So first, let's visit 19th century British and North American etiquette and needlework manuals to see how they uniformly promoted the link between sewing and femininity. Anne S. Stevens left no doubt in The Lady's Complete Guide to Crochet, Fancy Needing and Needlework that a feminine character cannot be quite perfect without a knowledge of all sorts of needlework and a downright hearty love of it too. Or, as Lucretia Hale explained in Plain Needlework, Knitting and Mending for All, although by all she was referring to women alone, sewing skills were important, even essential, to every girl, every woman, whatever her position in society. For both authors, needlework was a fundamental female activity, what Emily Sheriff described as the only indispensable feminine art. These were certainly not the only examples of 19th century prescriptive literature to stress the connection, nor were they alone in emphasising that femininity could successfully be expressed through proficiency in needlework. This carefully constructed link between needlework and women, however, was challenged throughout the 19th century. It was not always as stable as these authors would have us believe, and had in fact emerged out of an often overlooked history in which men played a vital role as embroiderers. Though men had largely disappeared from embroiderers' ranks by the 19th century, their involvement in needlework continued as tailors making structured garments for other men, or in tasks required of certain professions, such as the heavy sewing of sails carried out by sailors, though there continued to be exceptions. Before turning to the Goldfields, I think it's useful to consider the traces left of men sewing elsewhere in Australia. Primary sources reveal, for example, how men's skill with the needle could be of real benefit in the bush and on pastoral properties. So their sewing, however simple, could repair, protect or cover when it was strong and competently executed. So in 1862, Rachel Henning wrote to her sister Henrietta. From their brother's station Exmoor in northeastern Queensland, she reported back to Henrietta in England that their brother had purchased an immense wool press. Explaining its operation, she noted, "It takes several men to work it, but the power of pressure is enormous. The wool is laid in a box some 5 feet high and is pressed into about a quarter of the size. During their leisure time, they make wool bales. I'm happy to say we are not expected to sew the tough canvas, but Mr. Taylor and Mr. Hedgeland sit on the veranda and stitch away at them." The following year, Rachel wrote home of a very different needlework activity for the remote station's residents. Reading these examples together, a sense of two distinct kinds of sewing emerges. One inside the home, the other outside it. One more appropriate for women, the other an extension of men's labour on the station. Women as dexterous with their needles, men more rough, less aware of technique, but prepared to make an attempt. So Rachel's letter described: last evening the services of the whole station were pressed in to sew together the lengths of Osnaburg for the lining over which the wallpaper is to be pasted in their sitting room. Biddulph, Mr. Devland, Mr. Hedgeland, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Julian and Beckford, besides Annie and myself, were all hard at work. They really all managed very well, though of course they sometimes pinched their fingers and could not always manage to thread their needle. Mr. Taylor did best. He worked as fast as Annie or I, only he persisted in pushing the needle outwards instead of towards him in the orthodox manner. It's fascinating to think about how this corresponds with understandings of 19th century Australian masculinity. Historian Russell Ward's examination of Australia's 19th century masculine ideal was first outlined in The Australian Legend more than 60 years ago. As Ward explained, the behaviours, manners and values of the typical Australian stemmed from the 19th century bushman. He was, Ward wrote, a practical man, rough and ready in his manners, who swore frequently, drank heavily and gambled often. He was ever willing to have a go, but also prone to laziness. He was taciturn, over-talkative, suspicious of religion and intellectual and cultural pursuits. He eschewed authority, but was fiercely protective of his mates. This powerful image of bushman masculinity was underpinned by a freedom that emerged from the existence of men among other men, free from broader social ties. Extending this, historian Marilyn Lake recognised that the bushman promoted a particular model of masculinity. As a man who rejected domesticity, she defined him as the lone hand. His independence and spirit were to be found in the bush rather than in the home, and masculine camaraderie was favoured above marriage and family life. Clive Moore finds that in the 19th century, Australian manliness and mateship were closely bound. An ideal form of masculinity was exemplified by the bushman, though traces could also be found in earlier convict and gold rush periods. These were men who sought the company of other men over women and embraced time outside the home. The activities of the hardy mid-19th century explorers of Australia's inland can be examined in this light, alongside the ways in which their sewing responded to the rigours of traversing the frontier. Ludwig Leichhardt, one of the most respected and celebrated explorers of his time, whose disappearance in 1848 remains shrouded in mystery, published a journal of his first expedition in 1844 and 1845 from Moreton Bay to Port Essington. For the journey, which was to ultimately cover more than 3,000 miles of Australia's north, Leichhardt and his party were kitted out with 2 pairs of strong trousers, 3 strong shirts, and 2 pairs of shoes. Some of us were provided with ponchos made of light, strong calico, saturated with oil, so that we were well provided for 7 months. It would take Leichhardt and his team 14 months to complete the journey, so by September of 1845, he acknowledged, "We were sadly distressed for want of clothing. The few shirts which we had taken with us became so worn and threadbare that the slightest tension would tear them. To find materials for mending the body, we had to cut off the sleeves, and when these were used, pieces were taken from the lower part of the shirt to mend the upper. Our trousers became equally patched, and the want of soap prevented us from washing them clean. We had, however, saved our shoes so well by wearing moccasins while travelling along the eastern coast that everyone was well provided, particularly after the death of Mr. Gilbert, whose stocks of clothes I divided among my companions." As this comment makes clear, these men had little choice but to engage with sewing through sheer necessity, drawing on their resourcefulness to keep their bodies protected from the harsh sun and the searing heat. It's an idea extended in the diary of Edward Snell. The surveyor and engineer kept a diary between 1849 and 1859 in which he sketched, for he was also a talented artist, his observation of the colonies. Snells Diary is held by the State Library of Victoria, and it remains in copyright, so I won't include any images of it in my presentation, but you can explore the digitised version through the SLV's catalogue if you like. But this watercolour from the State Library of South Australia will give you a sense of Snell's work and his experiences. So while surveying York Peninsula in South Australia in 1850, he noted one day, "Made my first damper." The following day, he made himself a pair of mittens. Snell's isolation shifted these activities from women's work to survival. If he wanted to eat, he cooked. If he wanted to keep warm, he plied a needle. After 13 weeks in the bush, Snell's needlework became more pressing. In a self-portrait that's in his diary, he sketched the shredded hem of his jacket and trousers. A line of stitches runs from knee to ankle, mending the better leg of his trousers. In historian Robert Hogg's work on manliness in frontier societies, his case studies are Queensland and British Columbia, he notes how the frontier could expose the hollowness of the manly ideal. One had to adapt one's performances to the prevailing social and physical conditions. And this is an idea that allows us to recast needlework, shifting it from the domestic sphere to Australia's rugged landscapes. And for the men who performed it in such spaces, sewing was important when it could mean all the difference between exposure to the elements or protection from them. So images of the Victorian goldfields are as diverse as they are plentiful. Likewise, accounts range from admiration for the diggings and what they represented to a loathing of them and every degree in between. When John Shearer first glimpsed the Forest Creek diggings in 1852, he recorded, "The whole scene is one of busy, laborious life." 2 years later, Celeste de Chabrillon, wife of the French Consul General, wrote of frantic activity. "There is not an idler to be seen, gold obsesses them." Elizabeth Ramsay Lay, however, observed that the cost of gold was hard won, describing the high toll it brought on the diggers. The pale, anxious, haggard appearance of most of the men tell how dearly bought is the coveted gold. The industry of daytime gave way to a lawlessness at night. American merchant and journalist George Francis Train wrote of the diggings in 1853. "The moment the sun goes down, you have perfect bedlam in the camp, screeching, swearing and singing, pistol shots and barking dogs, all mixed up together." This engraving gives a bit of a sense, although I don't think there's quite as much swearing happening. But among these varying descriptions, it is clear that many men found the goldfields appealing for the freedom which was so unlike what they had left behind in Britain. And for Russell Ward, the practical qualities and skills required of diggers involved in alluvial gold seeking were not unlike those of the Australian bushmen. In this, their resourcefulness, adaptability, independence, mobility and mateship played out through the teams they formed. They embodied the traits that were recognised as typically Australian. David Goodman's scholarship on the goldfields explores them as sites of independence, both from societal hierarchies, so that is the master-servant relationship, and domestic influence. In this second aspect, he notes the independence enjoyed by men on the diggings had a gendered meaning. Single men celebrating their freedom from domestic constraints and responsibilities. So for many men in the early years of the rush who left their wives and families at home, or who were young and unmarried, domesticity played little part of their lives. Furthermore, gold seeking was considered a gendered activity, exaggerating masculine behaviours, particularly work, production and wealth accumulation. And you'll be hard-pressed to find any women in this painting of the diggings, and in many others created in the first years of the gold rushes. So masculinity and domesticity were in tension on the diggings, yet a range of domestic practices became the essential labour of men. As one digger recorded in 1856 in Ballarat's Star newspaper, "Mothers and sisters, there are none to mourn, mend torn clothes, sew on buttons, or to collect the discarded linen and consign it to the care of the laundress. Perforce, then, the digger must be his own laundress and needlewoman. And we are bound to confess that Sunday morning is the time most in favour amongst the diggers for the interesting process of shirt washing, boot greasing, trouser mending, button sewing, and similar useful and ornamental occupations." This description of the domestic practices of diggers challenges the 19th century divisions of labour: men's work outside the home, supported by women's work within it. Women were associated with the tasks and responsibilities of domesticity, their work underpinning the needs of their husbands, fathers and sons. But such a model could simply not be sustained on the Goldfields, as this digger's observation makes clear. For men greatly outnumbered women. Observers of the Goldfields recounted landscapes swarming with men, often neglecting to mention women at all. I've looked closely at this engraving by Thomas Ham of Golden Point in 1851 and found only one woman depicted. Of course, taking these depictions of the diggings as solely inhabited by men on face value is really problematic, as this was, we know, simply not the case. So in 1854, for example, more than 52,000 men were recorded on the Victorian Goldfields. Just over 14,000 women were living among them. 3 years later then, 123,000 men and more than 43,000 women were residing in Goldfields districts. In such a context, the work of Andrew Gorman Murray, a social, cultural and political geographer, is relevant. His discussion of bachelor domesticity takes two forms: a domestic arrangement in which a man chooses to live alone, or all-male households. Both of these examples were evident on the Goldfields, sometimes self-imposed, at other times out of convenience or companionship. These men were not always bachelors in the true sense of the word either, with some leaving wives and children in more comfortable surroundings, whether in Melbourne or Britain, as illustrated by S.T. Gill in his lithograph, Lucky Digger That Returned. Yet as part of these often temporary living arrangements, it was important that men rethink domestic practices. Just go back to that one. So this author, writing under the name of a miner, drew on the phrase useful and ornamental occupations. And this might give us some clue to the pressures that remained at the heart of these tasks. Sitting at the crossroads of masculine endeavour for the greater part of the week, feminine activity occurred en masse on a Sunday. Yet none of the tasks a miner described were truly ornamental. Rather, they were necessary and inevitable, part of the maintenance and repair that kept the diggers and their possessions as clean as possible and in good repair. His emphasis on interesting process suggests they were unusual for the men who practiced them. But what this comment also makes clear is that men could and did participate in really broad-ranging domestic tasks that inescapably included sewing. And it's unquestioned that men often carried needles and thread with them to Australia and possessed at least rudimentary sewing skills. The Emigrant's Guide to Australia was explicit in addressing the basic requirements of those considering emigration, encouraging them to learn to sew, darn your own stockings, patch up a pair of old shoes, black them daily, wash your own shirts and cook your own dinner. After a little practice at these necessary accomplishments, your education will be finished and you may go in pursuit of fortune under considerably lessened difficulties. So let's consider the extent of men's sewing on the diggings. The digger's outfit consisted of an extension, the digger's outfit was considered an extension of the tools of his trade, sturdy, hard-wearing, and suited to the rigours of the work. It was also distinctive in appearance. Eugene von Gerard's depiction of diggers at Black Hill, Ballarat, dated 21st of February 1854, provides a fascinating record of striped and checked shirts or tartan jumpers, of pale moleskin trousers, dark-coloured neckerchiefs at the neck, belts at the waist, cabbage tree hats, and long waterproof boots. It echoes the written descriptions of the men who tried their luck on the diggings, with many adjusting their outfit on arrival in Victoria to dress in a manner more suited to gold digging. As Polish miner Serwin Kozelinski noted of the adjustments in their clothing, everywhere shirts in blue stripes, low-crowned hats with wide brims, moleskin trousers, no neckbands or kerchiefs or ties. Legs used to patent leather shoes are now clad in half boots, or boots shod with iron plates at both ends and large nail-like studs in the middle. John Green, writing to his sister Eliza, described his outfit as he started for the diggings as consisting trousers, Tom Perkins' white hat, no waistcoat or coat, but a plaid jumper. It is slipped over the head and reached to the waist, broad leather belt, together with his weapons. Months later, Green outlined a deterioration in his appearance and clothing, recounting how he wore a long, thin beard, no moustaches, Tom's trousers, a blue Guernsey shirt, tight-fitting leather belt, an old white felt hat, sewed up at the two sides like Napoleon's to keep it out of my eyes, part of a black silk handkerchief around my neck. NB, I've spoilt it by tying it round the bucket handle to hoist water up with, having no rope. One very good boot, which makes up for the other, having no sole. Even with this outfit, Green wryly acknowledged, gone too far, sorry, that was my punchline here. Green wryly acknowledged, I am better dressed than most at the diggings. The wear and tear on clothing was considered a sign of Goldfields' endeavour, readily casting men as diggers. An unknown victim of crime was thus described in the Argus newspaper as dressed in a dark-coloured pea jacket, browned from the effect of the weather, a vest of a light texture, a blue-striped Guernsey shirt with flannel vest under, moleskin trousers, much soiled with clay, as if the deceased had lately been at the diggings, and a black silk handkerchief loosely tied at the neck, also a pair of lucha boots on his bare feet. Visual records further reveal the wear and soiling that clothing was inevitably subjected to. A man in the foreground of Richard Daintree's photograph of the Barclay Nevere Goldfields near Avoca, taken around 1861, stands at the top of a mine shaft, his hands on the windlass. He wears a creased cloth cap and moleskin stained around the ankle. His clothing is well worn and simple, tough and practical. He also sports masses of facial hair. Australian dress historian Margaret Maynard proposes that Goldfields' dress promoted an appearance of vigorous masculinity, which was further emphasised by what she calls this common practice of cultivating an excessive amount of hair on the face as well as the head. It's not surprising that men maintained their clothing through various mending and darning practices, given the physical nature of digging meant that clothes wore out quickly. Wearing patch garments was commonplace as Prospecting for Gold, or Rewarded at Last, published in the 1860s as part of Sketches of Australian Life and Scenery, complete in 12 plates, suggests. Most of the men in this lithograph have patches on the knees of their trousers. And if you look closely at the jubilant digger mid-handstand, you'll see his trousers are patched not only at the knee, but also along the inner leg seams. The lithograph emphasised the potential payoff of persistence and hard work, of living in tents with few comforts or pleasures and wearing old patched garments. It also indicates the value of needlework tools on the Goldfields. Henry Mundy described, while on the Fry's Creek diggings, how there were large tents called stores who professed to sell everything from a needle to an anchor. The implication is that some items sold in Goldfield stores were more useful than others, some essential, others of little real value. Another compelling motivation to sew was in protecting diggers' hard-earned winnings. Edward Snell travelled overland from Adelaide to Mount Alexander in 1852. Taking inspiration from his mate Bob, he responded to threats of lawlessness and crime by making a bag to wear beneath his clothing in which to carry his gold. One Sunday, Snell observed Bob making a bag out of chamois. He intends to wear it round his neck for safety. Must adopt some dodge of that kind myself. Later that night, Snell made his own version, describing it as a kind of suspender to carry my gold about my person. He was not alone in deploying his skills with a needle to reduce the risk of theft. Henry Mundy was all too aware of the dangers of travelling unprotected between the Ballarat diggings and Melbourne. He was, after all, an old hand rather than a valuable new chum who'd arrived in Australia as a boy in 1844. Mundy's strategy was to divide his profits from digging, putting only part in his pocket and £30 sewn in the lining of my cap. Beyond mending their worn clothing and concealing their gold or earnings in it, men also made garments, a really complex task that required more refined skills in cutting and fitting and competence in a range of sewing techniques from seams to buttonholes. The diary of an unknown Ballarat miner in the State Library Victoria's collection provides some of the most detailed evidence of this. One July morning, he spent an hour sewing moleskin trousers before breakfast. One evening in September, he set to work to sew trousers before the return of his mates, after which we all had tea. The following week, he recorded of his day, split some firewood and sewed leggings on trousers, and, having rigged myself up in waterproof, left for the hole. The domestic practices of this unknown digger are really valuable, but we know very little about him. His diary records daily life, possibly for the Scotchman, from the period July 1855 to January the following year. The casual way he records his tasks, both sewing and otherwise, implies that there was nothing all that extraordinary about his needlework. Rather, it formed part of his everyday experience of living on the Goldfields. And unlike James R. Moore, who openly acknowledged the limitations of his sewing, this miner was clearly competent with his needle. So these contrasting strategies employed by the unknown miner and James R. Moore shows us the ways that they adopted gendered domestic roles, one factual in recording his skilled work, the other comically clumsy. For Andrew Hanson, whose examination of 19th century shipboard diaries considers men undertaking domestic tasks such as sewing or cooking, this effect could be twofold. It could wreak havoc on a man's public identity while shipboard, given the confined spaces that made their actions observable. It could also affect how he framed his writing, guiding the diarist's dialogue with an imagined audience. One approach was to execute and describe their domestic tasks with an irony that recognised any transgression and that recognised their ineptitude, providing a protective buffer to public judgment. Yet those capable of sewing or cooking before leaving home reacted very differently. They were not self-conscious about their work, and nor did they write of it defensively. Instead, Hanson observes, there is no sense that these men are doing anything strange. And this idea can certainly be extended to the diggings, so that when our Ballarat miner writes in his diary of his sewing, What emerges is a skill that benefits his pursuit of gold through providing access to the clothing best suited to the demands of his work. Neither concealed nor noted with irony, this sewing instead enhanced his positioning as the ideal digger. The value of the unknown Ballarat miner's sewing comes even more sharply into focus when he writes about his needlework for his tent home. Tents kept by diggers in the early years were often simple and bare, and most made do with little comfort. This is vividly illustrated in Charles Lyell's pencil and ink sketch of an exhausted digger asleep in his tent. His boots have been kicked off and lie by his head, his pick and shovel dropped beside them. Covered by a blanket and resting his head on a pillow of some description, this digger is essentially sleeping on the ground. A slightly more luxurious level could be achieved by raising a digger's bedding. Some fashioned a stretcher out of available timber and canvas depicted in this second sketch by Lyell. The diggers in this illustration recline in their beds with steaming billy tea on the chest between them. Perhaps most surprising is that they drink it from delicate teacups and saucers, suggesting more than just a basic level of comfort. For many diggers, though, a priority was to make their tents warm and watertight. Tents could be notoriously difficult to waterproof, a fact recognised by Samuel Calvert in this satirical illustration, Domestic Bliss in Australia. With water streaming into the digger's tent, the caption promises, "If you use Fitzhumbug & Co.'s patent waterproof gossamer tent, calico, you may defy Australian rain," as did the happy pair above depicted. Waterproofing could be made all the harder when tents were torn and tattered. Throughout the winter and spring of 1855, the unnamed Ballarat digger made repairs to his tent. Starting in August with his mate Joe, they set to work to rip up rags and sew them for lining the tent. This was not a quick task, and even with two, he noted that they were occupied with this all the afternoon. On a windy, rainy day in September, he set to work to sew up tent, as it is in danger of blowing away. Despite working through the afternoon, he failed to finish. So, after visiting a friend's claim the following day, he went up to the tent and, on my way, bought a palm and needles and sewed up tent where it was torn. A palm was commonly used by sailors to assist when stitching sails, with its leather strap around the hand easing their work. Advertisements in Melbourne's newspapers suggest a good supply of palms in the colony, with Melbourne traders extending their advertising for practical goods, including palms, to Goldfields newspapers. Larger-sized thimbles were also made for men's fingers, though they are harder to find on the Goldfields. The phrasing of our unknown miner suggests his knowledge of the tools that could assist him with his work. James R. Moore and his mates perhaps recognised these tools too, though his remark that I showed you earlier, that his team were busy without thimbles, could be interpreted in different ways. And I've asked myself, could it be that in putting thimbles on their fingers, they might transgress the rugged make-do quality of many diggers' needlework, and more content to sew their tents with only a needle, thread, and the materials available to them? Or could the comment instead imply a regret for their lack of tools, a wish for thimbles to help them complete this challenging task? Whether made or purchased, working on tents could greatly enhance standards. Warmth was an important factor, as James Muir's diary, written while digging in the Castlemaine area between 1852 and 1856, attests. Muir was the chief officer on the Orpheus when it landed in Victoria in 1852. Shortly after, he led a party of men to Forest Creek and Castlemaine. Unlike many others who quickly came to realise that the sheer hard work of digging would never pay off, Muir persisted. In April 1854, he wrote, "Fixing and lining tent, making all snug for the winter." 2 days later, he noted, "Finished tent, pretty snug now." By August of that year, Muir was again occupied with his tent. On the 9th of August, he began a new tent, and 3 days later recorded being busy at the tents. 10 days passed again before he referred to fixing tents. He was really busy. Muir's writing suggests a familiarity with sewing heavy canvas, perhaps not unexpected given his occupation, for which he began his apprenticeship at age 13. And his sewing was worked around his digging, which remained his primary motivation. The chance of striking it rich still held, but tasks like this became increasingly necessary as Muir began to recognise, "I now begin to tire of this style of life. A change will soon be requisite should we not have better luck." The nature of digging, where small groups of men worked together, brought about a distinctive circumstance, what Russell Ward defines as a customary arrangement for these teams. So one digger took the role of tent keeper and cook, while others laboured in the search for gold. And this was not a practice only confined to the Goldfields, but more widely experienced. And as Robert Hogg explains, on the frontier, some men adopted gendered roles, mutually agreed upon divisions of work. He uses an example of Reginald Pidcock and his companion, known only by the pseudonym of Fred, and this demonstrates such an arrangement. Fred tended to their camp and prepared meals, while Pidcock was responsible for hunting the food. The exact nature of their relationship remains unknown. As Hogg speculates, they may just as likely have been intimate as simply good friends combining their resources. What we can see in James Muir's work in repairing tents and making them watertight then is a reflection of a division of chores. Contributing his skills to the team's enterprise may have been just as important as the physical digging for gold, because when the day's work was done, men needed to eat, sleep, and keep themselves warm, if only in order to get up the next day and begin again. Henry Hansen's painting Prospector's Hut, Ballarat, reveals what was perhaps a similar arrangement on the diggings, with one man cooking for himself and his associates using a long-handled pan over an open fire. They have presumably been out working their claim. The verso of this painting is inscribed, a representation of part of Harry's party. On the right, you'll perceive a digger frying sausages with evident satisfaction. I'd like to end with this painting for a particular reason. If you look closely, you'll see one line of stitching mending a jagged tear in the canvas above the head of the man standing. A second behind the seated man's cap attempts to join the canvas walls together. In depicting these details, the artist must surely have been aware of the approaches used to prevent drafts and drizzle penetrating the tent's interior. Perhaps he even sewed himself. What I hope to have highlighted in this presentation is the contribution that sewing made to men's experiences on the diggings. Although it may have been viewed as conventionally feminine behaviour in more settled areas of the colony and across the British Empire, undertaking practical needlework became an integral part of the material practices used to improve levels of comfort, both in terms of clothing and of shelter. Sewing could offer a form of protection for both person and property. It could be employed to make a tent and keep it warm and watertight, keeping diggers snug and dry. It could kit them out in the outfit that might, if chance was on their side, help them make their fortune, or maintain clothing in wearable condition until a digger next struck gold, then conceal that gold within specially sewn pockets. Especially in the early years of alluvial digging, when living conditions were primitive, men's needlework skills could elevate diggers' experiences from one of privation to something much better. While it may have been rarely acknowledged, sewing was almost certainly more widely practiced than these primary sources reveal. It's likely that some men did hide their labours with a needle, whilst others framed them as being novel for them. Yet good, competent needlework could also be a sign of resourcefulness and independence. It could mark diggers as capable and adaptable men. open to the tasks required in new environments, and as this case study demonstrates, as a critical part of the adventure of digging for gold. Therefore, acknowledging sewing and other activities perceived as women's work could be undertaken in the spirit with which many men approach this often temporary experience. One of openness for new activities and a willingness to work on chores that eased their transition from settled, stable lives to the demands of the diggings. A complete avoidance of domestic tasks was therefore neither practical nor desirable when sewing could make all the difference. Thank you.